Thank you.
Okay, good evening. As I'm sure most of you know by now, my name is Brian Hurley. I am sitting as the chairman of the Milton Zoning Board of Appeals for the purposes of the 40B application at 648 Canton Avenue in Milton. We've had a number of public hearings already. We've heard from a number of peer review consultants. And last week we heard from many representatives of the town of Milton. The agenda tonight, really it's the Ned Corcoran show for the most part. He's going to present a number of expert witnesses who will address a variety of different topics relating to the proposed structure and application. But my understanding is that the fire chief was going to be here at 7. I don't know whether he is or he isn't.
He is on.
He's on?
Yes.
Great. So, and I made it clear to Tim Zwinski that the fire chief could go first, and Ned Corcoran has graciously agreed to that. So you're here?
Yes. Chief Madden, Chris Madden from Milton Fire.
Good evening, Chief Madden.
I apologize. I have not watched the meetings in the past, but just reviewing the plans that I've seen online, a couple things do kind of stand out for me. It just looks awful crowded. Not a lot of space around the outside of the building. So, and I guess, I asked, Tim, at the beginning, he asked me, some of the things that we look for, and some of the things that I'm looking for is to make sure that we know who the proper ownership is. So any kind of changes in the building or anything after it's built, and we know who the ownership is going to be, so we can make sure that the maintenance and everything else is done in the proper manner. One of the things, a couple of things that we also ask for is water supply. Make sure that we have enough water at that property. Going uphill, we're a good distance away from Canton Ave. I know Canton Ave has a lot of water, but I don't think I've seen in any of the drawings where they were planning on putting the fire hydrant. And I think we'd probably need a couple of them up there, just with the way that the access road goes around. It's just one of those things where it's real crowded. We would crowd that space really, really quick. And one of the other things we ask for is, access and egress. As I look at some of these plans, and they show the fire truck, the ladder truck, which is our longest apparatus, going up and around, it shows us going into opposite lane several times. And, that kind of concerns me, where, if we do have a fire in that property, it's not just one engine, it's 3 engines, it's a ladder truck, it's a deputy chief's car, any kind of cop cars that will be responding to that, an ambulance. So it seems like we don't have a lot of space up there to operate. And that just kind of, jumping out at me real quick when you come up that driveway. There's a few spaces there. So those are some of the things that I look at, if we're responding to a medical or anything like that, the trash trucks coming down or something like that, or vehicles where we have to turn into the opposite lane, that kind of concerns me. So other than that, I think, does anybody have any questions? Did I answer a lot of the questions, or any of the questions of my concerns, my preliminary concerns?
Chief, how about the access from Canton Avenue? Is that adequate for your purposes with the proposed width of the driveway? Are there any issues with that?
So that does concern me. Like I said, right now, the width is, even they show us, going into the opposite lane. If we have to make the turning into Canton Ave, turning away from Canton Ave, and then when we come around the building, it shows us coming into the opposite lane to leave the property. It just seems a little tight right there to me. And I know, like I said, it's not just one fire truck. If we do have even a medical is a fire engine, an ambulance, and a cruiser. So that would tie up that access road pretty quickly in that front of that building. Just for my concerns, nobody would be able to get into their property or anything like that. And if we're there for a considerable time, half hour or so, that would really tie up that traffic coming into that property.
Chief, have you considered the availability and suitability of Holmes Lane, the adjacent private way? Is that something that you've taken a look at or thought about?
So yeah, so as a secondary access point, I've looked at that. That does concern me a little bit. It's not the width or interrupting the neighbors, and anytime that we drive anywhere, we're very respectful of the neighbors because we know that they have to live there, and we would never go 60 miles an hour. But it's the incline of that Holmes Lane. The engine can make it, but it's very, very tight for the engine as it goes up that hill. In my 20 years, I don't ever recall us trying to get the ladder up there, but I don't think I would want to try it and get it stuck on Canton Ave and shut down where we would have to get it towed out. I'm pretty sure the ladder would not make it up that hill with the close tolerances that happen when the engine tries to get up, and that's basically the front bumper and the back bumper hitting the asphalt when we go up there. And I've been up there a couple times in the engine. I know that they've been up there recently as well. So that is a major concern for me. Yes.
Those are the only questions I had. Anyone else have questions? Okay. Beverly, are there any members of the public who have indicated that they have a question?
There are not right now.
Okay.
Oh, wait a minute. We do have one. Robin O'Neill.
Okay.
Hi, my name's Robin O'Neill. I live at 30 Holmes Lane. Thank you for coming in and talking about the fire access. I'm very concerned about it as my house is the one that's basically in the middle of the lane. If you use that as an egress coming out of there, can you make that turn with a large, fire truck, any kind of equipment without basically coming into contact with my home? It's very, very tight.
Right, and I do know that street pretty well. A very good friend of mine in high school lived at the last house up there, so I do know that house pretty well. And I drove up there the other day just to check out the lay of the land, so to speak. And right now I haven't seen anything in the drawings to see where they would want to put that access road, whether they would move it or anything. I would be very concerned. I haven't had the engine go up there and try that. But a ladder truck probably wouldn't be. And I'm just saying right off the bat, thinking of the top of my head, they would probably have to move that to a space where we could exit the property or access the property. But I haven't seen that in any of the plans, so I don't know whether if they would keep it in the same spot or not. And one of the things that I did notice on this is if we do keep that little access there, generally that becomes a popular place to push snow in the wintertime. So, one of the things that we talk about is the ownership of the building after it's built and it's, and it's thriving. We like to keep a good relationship with the ownership, and technically those little access points where there's a chain or anything or something that only the fire department can use, it simply becomes a place where they push a lot of snow or debris or vehicles or anything like that. So that is a concern with me. But as far as that, I haven't seen anything, a drawing where they would keep that access road, if they would keep it in the same spot it currently is. But as of right now, that's where I stand.
The reason I brought it up was a couple peer reviews had suggested using that as an emergency exit because they don't feel there's enough one egress coming off of Canton Avenue is sufficient.
Right. So I agree that we should definitely have better access to that property. Like I said, looking at the current plans, it gets awful tight real quick, and we would have to park apparatus out onto Canton Avenue to, if we do have a multiple alarm fire in that building. Like I said, even a medical would quickly overwhelm that small parking spot out in front. So I would love to see a secondary access, but like I said, Holmes Lane, I just don't think it would be feasible with a ladder truck. We'd never be able to get a secondary ladder, the Randolph Tower, the Boston ladder, our ladder, or anything Right now, I don't believe it would work.
Okay. Chief, thank you very much for coming in this evening. This has been very helpful.
Right. Thank you. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to email me or through Tim. I'm definitely, there's a lot of these right now, and I'm learning a lot about these building projects. And one of the greatest things is I was speaking to the code compliance officer at the Massachusetts Firefighting Academy of the Department of Fire Services, and he was a wealth of knowledge. So we had a lengthy discussion. I think we're at 9 40B projects right now, and then plus multiple other projects in the town. So I've been reaching out to him just to try and keep myself educated in some of this stuff. So if you have any questions, please reach out and we'll try and help out any way we can.
Appreciate that. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Okay, Ned, I think this is it's your time, as they say.
Mr.
Great,
Chair,
thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr.
Make
Chair, if
sure
I
I
may, sorry to interrupt Attorney Corcoran. If I could request indulgence for just a few minutes from Attorney Corcoran. My clients, Joe Tamposi and Jake Tamposi, would like to say a few words if the board would be willing to entertain them for just a few moments tonight before we get started with the
Okay.
public comments. Would that be acceptable?
That's fine. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Jesse, and thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Corcoran. Apologies for the interruption here, but for the record, I'm Joe Tamposi. I represent Comprehensive Land Holdings, which is the owner of 648 Canton Avenue, and also 648 Canton Avenue LLC, which is the applicant for the comprehensive permit, which is before the ZBA now. Just briefly, I wanted to thank the board members and the public and the professionals who have all been involved on the hearings on this project to date. I know that you may not always see us, but we attend every hearing and site walk, and we really appreciate how much time, effort, and energy has gone into this project so far. I want to assure everyone listening that we are listening to all the comments and questions and feedback that we've received so far through this process. We're actively working with our team on how to best address and resolve the issues that have come up so far in order to make the best project possible. And I know that there have been some comments at the most recent reading about how this particular application and the 40B process is in some ways a cynical process, but we respectfully disagree with that. 40B is a proven regulatory framework for creating affordable housing. And we're coming into this process in order to create a project at 648 Canton Avenue that accomplishes those goals and is the best project that it can be. So we fully recognize that that is an iterative process, which I think Jesse brought up at the very start of these meetings. And we recognize and understand that that's going to involve addressing the concerns that have been raised to date and addressing the concerns that Mr. Corcoran and his experts bring up tonight. So we're absolutely open to hearing this feedback and open to listening and using that information, which is necessary to help everyone who's involved in this process ultimately create the best project possible and improve the project. So with that said, I don't want to take up any more time, but I did just want to introduce myself since I haven't been visible on these meetings so far, and thank everyone and let them know that we're looking forward to the commentary tonight.
Okay. Appreciate those comments, and we'll keep them in mind. Ned, you want to proceed?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Joe, for those comments. I'm going to look to share the screen. And look at that. Let's see if I can get this. There we go. Everybody see that okay?
Yep.
Great. So thank you for the opportunities tonight, Mr. Chair, to speak on behalf of the neighbors and abutters to this project. I'm going to speak along with David Black, who's a transportation consultant John Chessier, who is a site civil engineer, Scott Horsley, who's a hydrologist, stormwater expert, and Tom Palmer, who is an arborist. And we've got a series of slides to present. Will probably take somewhere between a half hour and 45 minutes to run through the slides. The first thing that I will do is acknowledge the need for affordability in Milton. I've been doing this. This is the first time I've ever represented a neighborhood group in opposition to a development. And I'm doing it in this case because I think this project is dramatically out of scale with what is reasonable for the property and for the site. But I've been pushing projects in the town of Milton to expand affordability in a reasonable fashion. And I think what you always do is you start with what's right for the land and the context that the land is located in, and design your project accordingly. You don't start with a unit count and a scale and then try to make it fit. This project is too big, too dense. Site and location cannot handle various impacts to traffic, groundwater, stormwater, and the like. I stand behind what I said earlier, that this is a somewhat cynical process. I understand that the developer considers it to be iterative, but I think it is cynical in the fact that you start often way out of whack with what's appropriate, and then force the town to work to something that may be reasonable. Development fails to meet fundamental standard of low impact design, which is a requirement under standard number 3 of the stormwater regulations. It's overwhelming in its relation to the development surrounding it, with historic single family dwellings and an elderly handicapped development next door that contains five 2 to 3 story buildings spread over 24 acres. There's no meaningful open space and no play area for children. They're trying to attract young families, affordable prices, but there's no place for children to play. That's a real equity issue, I think, relative to children here as opposed to children in other parts of town. It's too big and its impacts are too great. You heard from Steve O'Donnell, the chair of the Historical Commission, that this is an important structure as part of a set of buildings that are historic in their context. There's no consideration given to preserving the historic dwelling, to repurposing it for a couple of units, and perhaps adding other units of scale to this development to make a development that can fit and can work in the context and with the land. So this is an existing condition overview to scale. It's taken from the town's GIS website. Canton Avenue is down here. 648 Canton Avenue, as we know, is a long, somewhat rectangular property. Mergewood Road is a private lane that comes along by it. And there is a wetland behind 658 Canton Avenue, behind 652, which is the other property that is subject to the project eligibility letters that before the mass housing currently. And there is a stream that works its way along the edge of the property. What we show here is a dark blue line that is the stream itself and the edge of the wetland. The darker gray is the 25-foot no disturb buffer, and the lighter gray is the 100-foot no disturb. The 100-foot buffer from the wetland. You can see along this portion of the Kelly property that the 25-foot no disturb is really right up against the property line, and the 100-foot setback from the wetland goes substantially into the property. This is the existing dwelling. This is the garage. This is Holmes Lane on the other side with a dramatic rise up the hill, as you heard the fire chief say. This is Ms. O'Neill's house. It's a 1765 dwelling. Holmes Lane used to be a cart path, and it went around that building. And it'd be very difficult for access to be provided through this little corner with some major trees here would have to be cut in order to provide that secondary access. Right now, the driveway comes up further out here and exits onto Holmes Lane. Here's the building as proposed to scale in the context of the development. 4 stories on top of a parking garage that is larger than a football field. You can see that the project would essentially be clear cut, because to make room for the building, the parking, the roadway, and the underground detention systems that are proposed, there's nothing left in terms of trees, in terms of groundwater, anything. The roadway comes right up along the edge of that property line and the 25-foot no disturb, and the building is just on the other side. From the air, you can see that it covers an enormous amount of area on the property, and compare that to the scale of the football field at the high school. I think it's important to note here that Winter Valley, which is used as a comp for density, or at least units, is 24 acres with a long driveway in and 5 buildings containing 160 units. That is, on a comparative basis, you would be at about 8 units per acre. Here, we're something like 25 or 30 units per acre. So I want to do a quick comparison of the examples the developer provided regarding other large buildings in town and demonstrate relative to their context, their location proximate to transit and other services, and scale, how and why those are more appropriate than here. They point to 36 and 50 Elliott Street. There's 2 separate buildings built at much different times, one in the 60s, one in the last decade. I actually permitted the new building at 36 Elliott Street. It's the combination of 66 units across the street from transit and shopping. Located along Elliott Street, along the Neponset River, and the Milton Village Improvement Center. I actually permitted this building in my neighborhood. My house is right here. And I look over the fence at this 4-story brick building that is the Milton Hill House. So 66 units, walkable to Central, to the Milton MBTA stop, walkable to the Central Avenue MBTA stop, walkable to Star Market, restaurants, other opportunities and activities. 88 Wharf Street, 74 units, next door to the MBTA with a restaurant downstairs, walkable to other amenities. 131 Elliott Street, under construction now, I permitted. Walkable next door to the MBTA, walkable to other facilities. 36 Central, I permitted. 36 units across the street from the MBTA. And the last one with scale on a small lot, which would be Unquity House, is a senior housing facility that is down the river across the bridge from Mattapan Square MBTA station, built on the foundation of an old mill that was built on the edge of the river. And it sits on the edge of river across the bridge from the MBTA station and walkable to all of the amenities on Blue Hill Avenue across that bridge. Alternatively, it pointed to Winter Valley and Fuller Village as 2 fairly large and dense developments. What's key about those 2 is that they are senior housing, age 63 and over. Winter Valley, as I said, 160 units on 24 acres. Fuller Village is 350 units on 60 acres. But they have limited traffic because they are associated with senior housing. And they are spread on large campuses where the density is spread, and they have tremendous tree and other buffers between them and other properties. So quick scale, you can see the 40Bs. This was prepared a year ago by the planning board. It shows the scale of 40B developments compared to other large buildings. Physically, they're all bigger. 648 is bigger than all of these other developments. They're dramatically increased number of units. And then lastly, this is here we are again. This is an aerial of the proposed building in context with Holmes Lane and with Winter Valley. Winter Valley, again, 2 stories, 2 stories, 2 stories, 2 stories, 2.5 stories with a 3rd floor tucked into the roof. 5 buildings, 160 units, over 24 acres, with trees and wooded area on all sides, and plenty of access to both Highland Street and Canton Avenue. So at this, I'm going to hand it off to David Black, who is our transportation consultant. David, are you there? Can you unmute?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. I'm just going to run through a series of issues relating to transportation to express or to explain the issues that we see from transportation perspective. Building really on what Ned was talking about, this is a very dense project for a location which is really totally auto-dependent. It's just not consistent with sustainable transportation planning. There's no meaningful transit to support commuting. Walkability is limited by the remoteness from retail and the day-to-day services that residents need to use. On Canton Avenue, there are no crosswalks in the vicinity of the site. I think on the whole stretch between Thatcher and Highland and the high school, I don't think there's a single crosswalk on Canton Avenue. And it's limited to a single lane of travel in each direction. This means that there's an absence of separate turning lanes at the intersection. Not all of them are missing, but I think the most notable one is the northbound or eastbound approach to the Thatcher Highland intersection, which is just one single lane serving all of the through and turning traffic. And then finally, there are no bike accommodations on Canton Avenue. I would suggest it's possibly even worse than that there are no accommodations. There is a single edge line to the traffic lane, which cyclists try to use as a bike lane, but it falls far short. And actually, if you ride your bike along here, it sometimes have to get out of this very narrow 1 foot edge stripe, because when there's a catch basin, there's a chance you're going to get your bicycle wheel caught in the catch basin. So next slide, Ned. Yeah, the Canton Avenue is it's a roadway that is so strategic within Milton that it is congested and constrained throughout a lot of the day. It's not just a commuter route with peak hour commuter traffic. And this really raises capacity and safety concerns, not just during the peak commuting hours. Traditionally, traffic engineers look at the weekday morning and peak hour, but I think we need to consider that Canton Avenue is a busy roadway through a lot of the day. And unfortunately, the project traffic study relied upon just a single day of data collection. It had no data for other critical times of the day, such as the school or on weekends, say on a Saturday peak. And even during current pandemic conditions, there's a prevalence of stationary queuing or slowly moving traffic observed through many times of the day. Next slide, I think just a shot along this one is at Murdred Road, and the next one is I think is at the site driveway. Sometimes these queues are stationary, sometimes they're slow moving. Next slide, Ned. So the queuing issue here is significant because the project traffic analysis doesn't match what we're seeing in practice. It doesn't match the observed queues. And in particular, at the Thatcher Highland Street intersection, cars aren't clearing the intersection in a single cycle. And yet the traffic model doesn't predict the length of queues that we see out there in the field. I think because the traffic model doesn't recognize the fact that the intersection isn't clearing, it calculates the level of service, the operation of the intersection, on the basis of there's no cumulative buildup of queuing, which is what is happening in practice. And therefore, the level of service analysis as presented is really not accurate. It's not telling us about the proper operation of the intersection. And I won't get too technical on this, but in the industry, we use a model called the synchro model to simulate intersection operations. And in a situation like this, the synchro model really needs to be calibrated based on the actual conditions to yield valid results. You can't just run the model and assume that it's going to, that because it spits out a result, that that's actually matching the existing conditions. Next slide, Ned. Also on queuing, and this is more to do with the safety of the driveway. There's no queue, the traffic study doesn't provide a queue analysis for the driveway itself, and that's important. That's people leaving the site and wanting to turn left or right onto Canton Avenue. And we really need to understand the delay for residents and visitors exiting a large project like that. Is particularly since it relies on a single point of access. We know that people are when they are delayed by queuing, it affects their behavior, and it has a tendency to make people perhaps accept shorter gaps in traffic or be more impatient to get into the flow of traffic. And the existing site, I mean, already the driveway is impacted by the stationary or slow-moving traffic that I was talking about. And a lot of the time, you have to rely on driver courtesy to cross a stationary queue. In fact, to get into a stationary queue or a flowing queue, which is a very serious concern when it comes to making a left turn out of the site, because if somebody is letting you into the traffic lane, you can't see what's coming in the other direction of traffic flow. The sight line is completely impaired. Next slide, Ned. So again, as I mentioned, this is a large project relying on a single point of access. There are a couple of other things about the access point, though I know that the Town's peer reviewer mentioned this, but there's an inadequate driveway offset with Gulliver Street on the opposite side. And really, you know, if you're going to have an intensified use on a driveway like this, and you were designing it from scratch, you would either want them to align exactly, or more preferably have an offset so that turning traffic doesn't get mixed or confused or conflicted at the two kind of different points where the roadway opposite and the driveway meet Hampton Avenue. Seriously, on safety though, is the fact that the sight lines are constrained by stone walls and vegetation and utility poles. Now, it's possible those could be eliminated, but I think we really need to see how the sight distances can be provided from the driver's viewpoint, which is back from the stop line. It's behind how the sidewalk crosses. This is a not wonderful set of photographs, but it's taken from a driver's perspective, what a driver would see when they're stopped at the stop line, waiting to get out onto Canton Avenue. And you know, again, I can't say that if you demolished the walls and got rid of all the vegetation and utility poles that you wouldn't get the right distance. But as it stands, it's just not. It's really not showing that. Then finally, on the traffic side, you know, the crash analysis is always very important. The proponent has identified a high crash location at the Reedsdale Centre Street intersection, and they have committed to perform a road safety audit. This is a process required by the Department of Transportation, which involves getting all of the stakeholders together to look at the intersection, and kind of discuss and explore ideas for improvements. And what it yields is a menu of improvements that everybody kind of agrees to improve and address safety concerns. And they're usually broken out into short-term, medium-term, or long-term improvements. And in this case, the proponents committed to only implementing the short-term, low-cost improvements. And I think it would be important to keep an open mind to perhaps something a little bit more substantial that may come out of the road safety audit. I'm not trying to predict what that will be, because that's the purpose of the audit. And then finally, on the crashes, half of the crashes at the Thatcher Highland intersection involved personal injury. So the average accident crash rate at that intersection may be below average, but I think the fact that 50% of the crashes involve personal injury suggests that an additional road safety audit would be appropriate at that location. Next slide. The site plan, and I think the fire chief kind of alluded to this, there's not a lot of detailed information to show how the site plan can work. There's no information about how drop-off pickup would be handled or how school bus would support the project. The parking ratio of 1.5 we feel is inadequate for a dense development like this. The ITE guidelines suggest a parking ratio of 1.7. This is spaces per unit for this type of land use. And I recall that the architect noted in his presentation several weeks ago that the surface spaces, the external surface spaces in front of and behind the building would be allocated for visitors and drop off or pickup. But this would effectively reduce the parking supply for residents to only 154 spaces, which is a ratio of about less than 1.3 spaces per unit. And not necessarily a transportation comment, but we know that providing more parking implies more impervious surface, which is why, in the industry these days we really try to minimize the amount of external surface parking that we can. So I know that's not necessarily a transportation consideration, but we'll hear a bit more about that later. Next slide. I think, Ned, I'm going to hand it back to you here.
I'm going to take this one, and then I'm going to move on to John Chesia. So really the issue here is the project cannot, one thing, project, I think, cannot provide a secondary access to accommodate the scale and the number of units. I think the fire chief expressed a legitimate concern about access off of Holmes Lane. I think there's a reason why the project proponent didn't propose a secondary access off of Holmes Lane, because they knew it would be too difficult to build it. And I'm sure, and they may not have the right to do so. I know last week, Mr. Chair, I had raised and you were raising the issue of whether or not they have a legal right to access Holmes Lane for any purpose other than the purpose of a single family dwelling in context with the deeded right of access in common with others entitled to that there too. I can tell you that my clients will be prepared to fight that issue as it goes forward if they have to. But the condition of the roadway, the steepness of the hill, the location of the O'Neill residence, the location of a champion oak that Tom Palmer will talk about later, make it difficult to think about how you would provide that access for emergency vehicles in a very constrained little corner of the property. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Chesia, who's our site civil engineer, and talk about property access and site issues.
Ned,
John?
can I just ask Mr. Black a question or two?
Yeah.
Mr. Black,
Sure,
can
sure.
you turn yourself back on?
Can I do which?
Can you?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm on.
I'm just curious. It seems to me that a lot of the problems and issues that you've identified are off-site issues, not within the control of the developer. Kent Avenue is what it is. The Thatcher Street intersection is what it is. And that there's certain aspects of what you've talked about that are just not within the developer's control. I assume you would agree with that.
Yes.
And so I guess my question for you is, and maybe this isn't a fair question, tell me if it's not, but are you saying that given the current traffic situation, the constraints relating to the property, that there's no development that could be designed, no 40B development that could be designed there? Or are you saying simply that it's this development that doesn't work?
I think to say that the off-site issues are beyond the control of the developer is true, but that doesn't eliminate the possibility of the developer seeking to make off-site improvements that would address some of the issues. It's very common for a developer to have a mitigation package which includes improvements off-site. But I think,
for example, how would the developer fix the Thatcher Street Canton Avenue intersection? What could they do to fix that? Even if they wanted to spend all the money they had, how would they do that?
I actually don't know because I haven't looked at it, but I think it's something that should be explored. It is a difficult intersection, but I think to your second part of the question, I think this is not saying that there should be absolutely no development on the site. It's a question of it's the density of the development which leads me to be concerned about the things that I've been talking about. Now, the sightline issue, for example, could be addressed by the developer, but it would need to be explored. I haven't explored the design of that. What would happen if you cut back the retaining walls and vegetation, etc. So that one is within the control of the developer. But I think the essence of all this is when it comes to driveways, is your point loading a significant development on a single driveway that is not ideally located. If it was a much lower level of development, the concerns would be that much less.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You want to call your next person?
Yes, yes, please. John Chesia. Uh-oh. We're not.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can.
Okay. First of all, I think much of my work was echoed or maybe done by Sean Reardon. He did a great job, and I don't need to repeat all of his issues, but there's a few I wanted to hit on. And I'm going to start with this plan. This is called the Construction Management Plan. And what it shows for construction management is a little stone tracking pad, 25 feet square at the entrance. It shows a bunch of red circles with a line through them for the trees to be removed. The buildings are identified to be raised, and then there's a dark black line around that's the line of sediment control. That, might be adequate for if you were going to raise and build a new house that's similar to what's there or even a little bigger. But, we are talking, maybe go to the next slide, Ned. I mean, we're talking a massive earthwork project here. There's a building proposed that's over the dimensions of a football field, 15,000 cubic yards of excess material. I just did a quick calculation for the building footprint, the stormwater systems and all that. That is like 535 tractor trailer dump loads that have to go somewhere out of the site. When you take the soil that's there, we know that the soils are silty, tight glacial tills, not particularly great soils. They're pretty dense. They don't drain well. If it's dry, you have massive amounts of dust. If it's wet, you have mud. I've been working in this area, South Shore, in towns that have horrible similar soils for decades, and I've seen it. And that's what you have. It's very rare to have perfect conditions where you get like a very light, maybe a quarter inch of rain every couple of days to keep the dust down, but not be enough to make it muddy in this type of condition. And you look at the excavation that's got to be done, it's 14 feet deep on the far side of the building away from Canton Ave. You're talking huge excavators, trucks, you got to pile this stuff somewhere, you got to deal with it. It's a big, big thing that's not even talked about. And there's a lot of impact from that. The other aspect is that we know the groundwater is shallow, at least in the spring. This is a pretty dry spring, so they're not going to see water as high as you would in a typical spring, but the conditions that they did test in 2020, 20 inches, 33 inches, they hit groundwater. So if you're putting a 14-foot excavation in for the building, as well as other excavations that are into that water table, if any of this work's done when the water table's high, and I think you probably have a few months in the maybe July, August, September, possibly into October, where the water table might be low. But if it's high, then you have all this groundwater that's got to go somewhere. Since the site slopes to Canton Ave, there's really no place to put it other than Canton Ave. The plan doesn't show any place for workers to park, stockpile material. This is a massive building. There's going to be multiple trailers with people that have electrical trades, plumbing trades, structural steel, painters. They all need a place to put their stuff. There's going to be a lot of trucks parked there. It's a big deal to determine how you're going to deal with that. And that's going to have a big impact on traffic and access and all of those things. Because the whole site basically slopes towards Canton Ave, and you have these massive amounts of exposed silt, very silty soils. If you get a heavy rain during that, it'll be a bear to control. These soils, from my experience, when you get water that stirs up the silt and you get it suspended in the water, it takes sometimes weeks to settle out. You just go through these puddles that are muddy for forever. It's a big issue. And I think that's something that the board needs to consider. The next issue I want to talk about, this is their drainage plan. So the blue is the pipes, catch basins, manholes, and then you can see the underground pipe storage systems, which all tie into Canton Ave through a 24-inch pipe. Canton Ave has a 30-inch pipe that was built who knows when, but certainly not recently. That pipe takes the existing brook at the bottom, which will show that picture now, Ned, and then we can flip back. So the brook drains into Canton Ave. You can see there's a granite sort of culvert that I believe used to go all the way under Canton Ave. But if you look in the culvert like I did, there's brick where it takes the brook and turns it into the 30-inch pipe.
Inside.
Maybe go back to the prior plan. So
That was here.
that's where the photo was taken. So the point here is, even though they're detaining the water through these underground systems, it's then being tied directly into a 30-inch pipe of, we don't know how old, but my guess is probably at least 50 years old. And maybe now, just skip down to the bullet point sheets, two slides there. So right now, when it rains on that site, water sort of flows over in the surface. It's a heavily wooded site for much of it. There's a couple of, 20 inches to 30 inches of top and subsoil, which acts kind of like a sponge under the trees. Some of that gets soaked in. Ultimately, it may work its way in a really big storm into Canton Ave, in which case it would flow along the gutter into catch basins. And in a big storm, it's probably going to bypass the catch basins. I'm sure some of you may have driven by there in a heavy, heavy rain, and I suspect that the catch basins don't catch all the water, because if you go to the bottom of the hill, there's a great big cutout that dumps right into the wetland on the same side as this building, just past Winter
Winter
Valley
Valley.
there. And this cutout is probably 2 to 3 feet wide and 1 foot high, right next to a catch basin. So clearly the catch basin's not taking it all. If you take and connect it directly into this pipe and you put all this water in there, the hydraulics of the pipe are completely changed, and it could end up with a pressure flow situation. It's a fairly steep hill coming down. I know I've seen it because I'm sort of a drainage person and I look for these things, but when you have that type of a rainstorm and you have that type of pressure, especially when you now add this 24-inch pipe into the 30, you can blow manhole covers right off their, right out of their, right off their frame. And that's a safety hazard for sure. Now, granted, that's not going to happen in a small rainstorm, but they're designing this as if this pipe will just take the 100-year rain and pipe it away. I would be extremely surprised if the pipe is sized right now to take a 100-year storm from their system, never mind the existing systems, that connect to it. All the catch basins, that brook, which is not insignificant drainage area. So I guess our point with all of that is that the board should require that they do a hydraulic analysis to see what the actual impacts to the town municipal system are. Next, we'll talk a little bit about stormwater standards. There's been a lot of discussion about you can't infiltrate, the water table's too high, the soils are poor, they don't infiltrate well. But you're required to infiltrate, you're required to demonstrate that you meet that standard. And if you can't, you show that you put in environmentally sensitive site design, low impact development, swales, areas that have less impact than a massive parking garage with building, over 1.5 acres of impervious area. And there's no sensitive site design at all. And as Sean Reardon said, there's no exceptions. They have to meet that somehow. The next one, standard 4, is essentially treatment of stormwater. Standard 3 is infiltration. Standard 4 is treatment. Treatment means removal of sediments. It also can include removal of pathogens and other contaminants in the water. If you can infiltrate water, that generally acts as a filter, and that takes care of phosphorus, bacteria, things like that from getting into the drainage system. In this case, there's catch basins, and then there's proprietary treatment systems, which are basically like a swirl chamber and a manhole. Those are pre-treatment devices. They're not actual treatment devices, so they don't meet that standard either. Overall, it's clear that the project has too much impervious surface for the land that it's sited on in order to accept it and handle the storm water. Next. Now this slide is their existing condition plan. The blue boxes are the test pits. I know there were more dug recently. I suspect that groundwater is lower than normal because we're in somewhat of a drought situation, but they usually can find indicators, and it'd be interesting to see what the later tests show. But the two brownish orange sections are some sections that are shown on the next plan. So these are.
So one thing quick, John, is those two lines through the property are relate to the next two views.
Correct.
And if you were standing on the first one, you would be standing roughly at the left line on the left, looking towards Canton Avenue. And the second one is if you're standing back here, looking towards Canton Avenue. And so the right-hand side is Holmes Lane, and the left-hand side is the stream side on both of these.
So the purpose of these two sort of sections, you can see the building, the parking garage is the lower level. The top, I'm looking at the top slide now. So you got Holmes Lane on the right, you got the proposed road. The dark blue line is the water table estimated at basically 20 inches, 2 feet below grade. test pit 2 and test pit 6 were through this cross section, and that's why that was taken there. This is essentially at the front edge of the building, or close to the front of the building. The storm drainage system underneath the building is indicated here, which that is completely below the water table. And if you look across, you can see roughly where the stream is located, and the storm drainage system is also below the stream. And that stream flows, if not all the time, pretty close. It might, we don't know, I haven't seen it enough to say, but they say it's an intermittent stream. And if it's intermittent only probably for a very short window based on what, neighbors that have lived there a long time have observed. The next one is sort of towards the back part of the building. So you can see how much the parking garage is below the grade. Now that test pit was done in September in the dry season. They didn't see any water. My guess is that there were probably indicators that may have been hard to pick up because the soil was so dry, but the parking garage, the floor of it's completely below the level of the stream. Now, what they're going to have to do with something like that, because it's in the water table, you're going to have to deal with some drainage system for the structure. I think you can flip. So they'll need to put in foundation drainage so that groundwater doesn't just flow into the garage and constantly cause a problem there. That collected groundwater has to go somewhere, and the only place it can go ultimately is towards Canton Ave, either connecting into the pipe or flowing over the ground into the road. I'm sure everybody's driven by where you see somebody's sump pump pumping out into the road. And in the wintertime, that's a hazard, safety hazard for icing, all kinds of things. So more than likely it would need to tap in directly if the town allows that, in which case you're taking up more capacity in the storm drain that's already there that, in my estimation, is probably undersized to begin with. We're just asking the board to ask them to assess what that impact might be. How they're going to deal with it. What are you going to do? And how is that going to affect the stream? And that's pretty much.
So I've done a fairly quick table based on modifications to plans, and these aren't specifically before the board, but the developer purchased the property on September 11th of 2019. And a week later, they dug their first 3 test pits, which showed that the site was pretty dry. And so the initial stormwater plan actually showed a plan for infiltration with 4 sets of Cultex systems, 1 under the building, 3 in other locations. Because the site was dry, I'm assuming they thought that they could infiltrate water, stormwater, into the ground in accordance with the stormwater standards. In January, they filed their application for project eligibility, and that's what was indicated on the plans that were filed with Mass Housing. But in February, they went back out and took 3 more test pits, and they discovered the site is actually pretty wet when it's wet, with high groundwater table. And so the application, the plans that were submitted for the application actually flipped the stormwater system from an infiltration to a detention system, and then tying to the town's drain system, all in violation of Standard 3, as we heard from Sean Reardon and from Mr. Chessie. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to, unless you have questions, Mr. Chair, I'll turn that to Scott Horsley.
Can you hear me, Ned?
Yep.
Yeah, I do not have any questions.
Thank you. And we'll obviously all be available for questions of the board's pleasure at the close of this presentation.
Sure. Mr. Horsley, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Hurley. So I'll pick up where John left off and suggest that in addition to the problems with flooding the garage and the requirement to drain the groundwater to try to keep the garage dry, as was mentioned earlier, we do have a wetland next door, and we do have a state Wetlands Protection Act which this project must comply with. And that act and regulations requires no alterations to the wetland. So if we drain down the groundwater in the site to protect the garage, which might be feasible, I'm not sure, we will impact the wetland because the groundwater on this site provides base flow to the wetland. So the project is well within jurisdiction. And again, if in fact the plan is as As Attorney Corcoran mentioned, the original plan was to be compliant with the stormwater standards to infiltrate stormwater. What they found out by doing some additional test pits is, given the size of the project, that doesn't work. But the existing detention system does not infiltrate. So again, they're not meeting this stormwater standard number 3. And I'll also get into some water quality impacts. This slide shows the hydrologic setting on the Milton GIS plan. You can see the parcel noted, and then the stream next door. That stream looked like it went across Canton Ave and continued towards the high school, but it currently, as Mr. Chesia mentioned, discharges into the storm drain going down Canton Ave to the northeast. And then it outfalls right here into the Wendell Park area. And as I'll get to in a later slide, that stream then contributes to the ultimately to the Neponset River. The other hydrologic connection that I just want to reinforce here, if you go back to and point at the parcel itself, again, the groundwater on that site currently flows, some of it flows to the west to the stream. That's why the stream flows most of the year. The so-called base flow is because of the groundwater under that site. So if the project changes the groundwater levels, which it certainly will as currently designed, that stream flow will be altered. And the key term in the wetlands protection regulations is you cannot alter a wetland resource area. Next slide, please. So there was some discussion, there's been a lot of discussion about this standard 3. As I think I mentioned at a prior hearing, I've served on Mass DEP's Stormwater Advisory Committee since its inception in 1995, and I was one of the people who recommended this standard. So I understand what the purpose of it is. Again, the purpose is to maintain pre-development and post-development hydrology. During a March 9th meeting, which I attended and listened to, the applicant indicated it was their opinion that they did not need to meet this standard, and they only needed to comply with it to the maximum extent practicable. And I'll just state unequivocally that that is absolutely not true. They do need to meet standard 3, and as it says in the 3rd bullet, if you don't believe me, talk to Sean Reardon, and if you don't believe him, read the standard. It's very clear. They do need to meet it, and they are currently not meeting it. And again, that standard is there to protect the wetland. Next slide, please. As was mentioned, there's 2 sets of test pits here, and I think they show some pretty interesting and very challenging or brutal site conditions that are going to be difficult for even a smaller project to comply with on the site. Specifically, test pits 3 and 4 towards the front of the site, and yet right there show an 8-foot fluctuation seasonally. That's a very significant fluctuation. And as some of the test pits done in February show, as John Chesia mentioned, the water levels get to within 20 and 30 inches of the surface. I don't believe these are seasonal high groundwater levels, which is what is required to be used as the design criteria, because those are typically met in April or May. This April and May, as Mr. Chesia mentioned, is not a wet year. So DEP requirement is to look at long-term so-called seasonal high groundwater levels and use those for your design. So I would suggest these levels that show the water table within 20 or 30 inches, which is quite problematic, is not even the highest water level, the design standard that is supposed to be used. So this is again, I think as the applicant indicated in a prior hearing, this is a very, very difficult site to design anything on. Never mind a high intensity project like the one we have before us. Next slide. And so this gets into the connections again and the water quality impacts. Again, this shows the flow down to Canton Ave, down Canton Ave to through Wendell Park, and ultimately into the Pine Tree Brook. Now, Milton, like many other urban areas throughout Massachusetts, are now part of a relatively new regulatory program, and this is a federal and state regulatory program, which again, 40B does not provide any waiver ability to. They must meet in full these regulations, and these regulations are tied to the Federal Clean Water Act and the State Clean Water Act, and they have to do with water quality in the receiving waters. It turns out that Pine Tree Brook and the Neponset River are impaired for phosphorus and pathogens. That means they've been tested by the state. They are listed in the state regulations as impaired. And the so-called MS4 permit that the Milton is now party to, which comes from both EPA and DEP, requires that the town regulate projects such that they do not further impair those resources. Therefore, there needs to be, in my opinion, a cumulative analysis for those two groups of pollutants, phosphorus and pathogens. And I don't believe either one has been provided. And if we can go to the last slide, please, Ned. I'm sorry, there was one more. This is really the MS4 program. So again, this is Clean Water Act, federal and state program. I've pretty much already covered this. So we can go to the next slide. And this is my summary. So I'll just walk through these very quickly. I believe, based upon the comments that I've made and certainly Sean Reardon's comments, which I believe are 100% in line with mine, that the project should be redesigned and specifically must meet standard number 3. I don't think that's debatable. And again, if we need to, let's read the regulations together. And sounds like the ZBA has some lawyers, so they should be able to figure this out for themselves. The second bullet is evaluate impacts on adjacent stream. Again, this is something that's going to be required under the wetlands regulations, given the proximity to that stream. The existing project as designed, I'm pretty convinced will have alterations and impacts, but that's something that does need to be assessed. The third bullet deals with what I was talking about with respect to water quality impacts. There needs to be a phosphorus and pathogen loading analysis relative to those 3 resources, Wendell Brook Park, Pine Tree Brook, and the Neponset River. And that should be a cumulative impact assessment. I won't take the time to explain that now. Mass DEP does have very clear guidance on how one does one of those cumulative impact assessments. Again, I don't believe that's been provided yet. And then finally, the project, once that assessment is done, the project needs to be redesigned to provide treatment on site. They cannot just discharge raw stormwater into the town's stormwater system, because as we've already indicated, that goes directly into the resource areas, Neponset Brook and Wendell Brook and Pine Tree Brook. So there needs to be treatment on site. This treatment is commonly provided, and you read the guidance documents from Mass DEP, through something called low impact development design. Saving trees, providing open space on the property, setbacks from wetlands, and retaining the stormwater on site, and using vegetative practices such as constructed wetlands, bioretention, swales, etc. And again, from my review, none of that has been provided. So I will stop there, Mr. Chairman, and see if there are questions on anything that I presented, or I'll turn it back to Ned.
And I'm going to turn it over to Tom Palmer, and he will be my last witness, and I'll have a brief follow-up when he's done.
Yeah, this is not really a question related to the testimony. Thank you for that testimony. But will you, if you haven't already, will you be able to submit to the board all of this information in written form? Because it may be shocking to you that we don't have the capacity to take all of the notes that you might think we do.
I have submitted reports from each, but we'll make sure that that they are in and loaded.
So, and these slides would be helpful.
And I'll make sure that the entire slide deck is loaded as well.
That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Tom? Tom Palmer? Bev, do you know if he's there?
Bev, it looks like he's on the attendee side and needs to be made a panelist.
Here I am. Can
There
you
we
hear
go.
me?
Here he is.
Thank you. My name is Tom Palmer. I'm a wetlands consultant and botanist. I was asked to look at the site early in March to note the larger trees. Somewhat similar to the architect peer reviewer said a catalog of trees should be provided. This graphic gives you an idea of the tree cover at the site. And it's an annotation of the existing conditions plan provided by the proponent. And it's much better because instead of looking like thumbtacks, the trees look scaled to their actual dimensions. And you can see some are larger, some are smaller. You see there are two tints of green. There's a sort of a forest green or jade green and a more yellow green. The darker green are coniferous trees or evergreen trees, and the lighter green are deciduous trees. And the trees are also of varying sizes. Here we see two sizes, and we can see the larger ones are concentrated around the house, along the driveway from Canton Ave, and generally around the perimeter of the project. This graphics is a lot more satisfying to me. Not only does it show the trees in their actual scale, but the site plan gets the trees wrong in many places. For instance, there's a swamp white oak at the corner of Holmes Lane and the secondary driveway that the plan shows in the middle of Holmes Lane. So it's above those orange bars, those orange dashes, right in the middle of the road. Yeah, it's that largest circle, and the circle is moved where it actually is instead of being in the middle of the road. At any rate, there are other trees that are missing, large trees that are missing from this plan. Some are misidentified. The ones that were measured incorrectly. So I would say the catalog we have been talking about is still not been performed. Can we go to the next slide? Here's a picture of some of the larger trees in front of the house. On the right is a purple beech. It's a European species, often planted for a showpiece or specimen tree. Over the left, you see some of the Norway spruces that are major feature of the site. These are what I would call legacy trees, meaning that they descend to us from people who are dead now, people who planted them, who decided where to go and so forth. As a ballpark definition of legacy tree, I say a tree that is either 75 years old or 75 feet high or both. I particularly looked at such trees on the site, and I would say there are over a dozen of them. If you look at the construction management plan, you can see that they are planning to use the whole site for the building, the driveways, the detention areas. There really is nowhere on the site that is not going to be bulldozed with a stump scrubbed out and elevations all changed. And that means all of these trees will go. And that will certainly change the look of the site, and it will change its ability to store water, for instance, or support wildlife, or just participate in the general feel of the neighborhood, which is not an urban feel, but an area where open space exists on every lot and buffers them from adjoining lots. Could we go to the next slide? This picture is looking from the front of the house easterly toward Holmes Lane, and you see there's a little recycle bin out of the end of the lane. That tree beside the recycle bin is the oak I mentioned earlier. It is in this little list at the left. I say the girth matches the state champion because I taped the larger trees. I took a tape and hugged them and got their circumference in inches, and then applied the pi rule and got their diameter as a breast height, which is a conventional way to measure the girth of large trees. That particular species, the state hasn't recorded a larger one in girth anywhere. The one that matches it was measured in Lancaster in 1989. That is the same intersection that has been discussed about whether it could be access or secondary access. And you look to the right, there's another large tree there that's surrounded by saplings. That's, it's not in the list to the left, but that's a sugar maple that somehow didn't make it onto the site plan. It was just left off. So the point of listing some of these trees, I believe, is to show that when you come to this site, you're not coming to a blank slate. You're coming to a place that shows a lot of effort, human effort over many generations to create an environment. And one of your options when you develop such a site is to say, can we create some continuity by keeping some of these features, which will not only help bridge the difference, but protect the area and the neighborhood from the impacts of the site. And from my review of the plans, I would say that when the work is done, there will be no natural features remaining anywhere on the site. In order to come to the site and figure out what it was before, you will have to bring a backhoe and dig 3 feet down before you will find anything that existed before the work began. And that's the conclusion of my report.
Tom, can you just one additional point? A lot of these trees are along the property line. There's also a significant number of trees that are just off the property line. And as you go along the rear side, that ring road comes right up to the edge of the property line. Are the trees on the Kelly property next door likely to survive the impact of that construction?
As you can see, there was a tendency to let big trees grow along the stone walls that define the lot. And that is on both sides of those stone walls. And when you come in under a tree to redevelop or pave or whatever, you have to work in the soil, and the trees, most of the roots are in the first 6 inches. So they call that the drip line, namely the area under the horizontal spread of the branches of the trees. And the conventional wisdom, true, is that if you work within that drip line, you will injure the tree and endanger it. And certainly there are trees on either side of those walls, and the work comes right up to the stone walls in most places. So you are, in fact, playing roulette with the neighbor's trees if you work up to the edges of the walls.
Thank you. So a couple of concluding slides, Mr. Chair. One of the things that I understand about 40B development, other development, is it needs to pay attention to the Commonwealth's sustainable development principles. There are 10 principles listed and are significant. And I think as part of the preliminary applications, the applicant is supposed to identify whether and how the project would comport with those principles. There are 7 of those principles where the project fails to comply. The first is that you concentrate development in mixed uses. This project fails to mix uses and support revitalization of the town's business center. It has no connection to the commercial district. It is auto-centric and it is not easily walkable to any business district. It should be designed to protect land and ecosystem. Project fails to protect wetland resources and a clear cutting will result in the loss of major trees and significant habitat for birds and other fauna. You should use natural resources wisely, but this project fails to promote any conservation of natural resources. Project violates as well. It should expand housing opportunities, and we acknowledge in this case that would, but it fails to provide housing near jobs, transit, or shopping in a way that is compatible with community character. Should provide transportation choice. This fails to provide any transportation choice. It's auto-dependent. It will not provide opportunities to maximize mobility, reduce congestion, conserve fuel, improve air quality. It should increase job and business opportunities. This project will do nothing to attract business and/or jobs located near housing. Finally, it should promote clean energy. And as we've heard, this project is auto-dependent, so will not reduce greenhouse gas emissions or the consumption of fossil fuels. The last slide is the building. on top of the Milton High football field. That is to scale. It's 350 feet long by 200 feet in width. It covers the full football field, plus end zones, plus sidelines. Thank you for your time. The team is available to answer questions that you may have and others may have. Thank you, Mr. Hurley.
Thank you, Mr. Corcoran. I don't have any questions. I get the drift of the testimony. Do any of the other board members have questions? Mr. Brown or Mr. Daver?
I don't have any questions, no.
Do we have people that are asking to be heard this evening?
Can Ned take the video down? Thank you.
Beverly, are there people that are looking to?
Yeah,
Speak.
it just came up. The slide show was blocking, but no, not right now.
Okay, it was my understanding that,
Oh, wait a minute, we do. I'm sorry. Somebody just put their hand up. Please speak. Can you unmute?
Yes, this is Ann Susadel. Can you hear me?
yes,
Yes.
we can.
Yes, I live at 56 Holmes Lane, and I had a question for Tom Parker.
Palmer's my name.
Tom Palmer.
Oh, excuse me, sorry. You had mentioned that trees play a role in stormwater retention and in providing habitat for birds and other fauna to support wildlife.
Yes.
Would you be able to enumerate other ways how trees enhance and enrich human living? I was thinking about how they deal with carbon dioxide or provide shade.
Well, certainly both those features. Generally speaking, oxygen is perhaps more important to us as humans than CO2, but they do produce both. In New England, trees are the default condition. If you do nothing, you get trees in most places. And so we are all comfortable with them and we all live with them and we all enjoy going under them, coming out from under them, looking at them out windows, perhaps hanging swings from them or building houses in them. As far as absorbing rain, you may know that when it begins raining, you can go under a tree and stay dry for 20 minutes. They pick up that first shot of rain, then they drip it down on the ground where the leaves have decayed and created a deep soil that absorbs the rain further. So they really do create the living film that we inhabit in this part of the world. And in a project like that, like is being discussed, when it is done, you can start the clock again and say, we can't pay to get a 70-year-old or 75-foot tree in here, but we can plant them. And maybe in 75 years, we'll start to get what we lost. But the fact is the site plan doesn't provide room to do any of that. There just isn't a place on the site to recreate the tree cover, which now covers, I estimate, 65% of the site with the big old trees and the smaller saplings that have come up underneath them.
Thank you. Bev, anyone else?
Yes. Beth?
Hi. Hi, this is Elizabeth Janiga from 658 Canton Avenue. I had a question for Mr. Black. Is he still on?
I don't know.
Yep, he's there.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Mr. Black. Last week, there were some comments made that I'd like to hear what you thought of. The representative from our police department made a comment or indirectly implied something with regard to the traffic and congestion. And it was our town planner, I believe, Mr. Zawinski, that also commented upon his comment. And that was with congestion, and it was within reference to Canton Avenue. With congestion, in theory, this is somewhat provides safety in the sense that nobody's moving. That in theory, there's less accidents because you have congestion, and you have a crowded roadway. So I'd like to know what you think of that comment.
That's an interesting comment. I think I know what the point being made is, and I do agree with it, but I'm not sure that strictly it applies to congestion. I think what he may have been alluding to is the fact that when speeds are lower, there tends to be a reduction in accidents, or what's most important is it's a reduction in severity of crashes. It's very important to understand that as the speed of traffic increases, the personal injury and or fatality percentage rises dramatically. So I think that I wouldn't agree that I would agree that slower traffic is good for road safety, but I wouldn't necessarily say that congestion is. In other words, people are stuck, they're not really moving, or they're moving very slowly, because in those situations, drivers take risks, sight lines get impaired, things like that. So there's a trade-off between the fact that if a driver is stuck in congestion, they are less likely to kill someone or badly injure them. But on the other hand, at some point or other, all of those cars will move. And, I think that it's really, in my mind, the real thing is that speed is a factor in fatalities and injuries. And a roadway is safer when we have slower speeds. This is why we have slow street programs, or we used to call it traffic calming, where we do things with the roadway, not just a speed limit, but we do things with the roadway from a design perspective. Years ago, I developed the traffic calming program for the city of Cambridge, where we introduced very subtle changes in the roadway design to make drivers slow down without necessarily thinking, I got to, there's a speed limit, I must slow down. It's subtle changes in the roadway design. It's changes in the appearance of the roadways, clues to drivers that there might be pedestrians. And I know Mr. Hurley asked me earlier about the intersection of Thatcher and Highland and what at Canton Avenue and what might be done. And I sort of said, well, I don't know, I haven't looked, but I do think that would be the point of a safety audit to see because when we look at improvements these days, we don't just look at improvements for cars, we look at improvements for all road users. And Thatcher Highland is a very important crossing point, particularly because it's an offset intersection. And that's why there is what we call an exclusive pedestrian phase. The traffic is stopped in all directions to let pedestrians cross, which is not necessarily the best thing to do, because what's risky about pedestrian behavior is the longer you have to wait, the more likely you are to jaywalk. And so sometimes it is, we generally, if it can be done safely, we prefer what we call concurrent crossing, so that we reduce the time that pedestrians have to wait. I'm sorry if that's a very long answer, and I diverted a little bit, but we welcome slower streets. And I wouldn't say based on that we welcome congestion. Does that answer your question?
Yes, basically, but it also makes me make a comment that I concur with you, because people speed through Milton. Being slow is safer, but then you do have to take into account human nature and people's erratic behavior. when they're forced to go slow or forced to sit in congestion and they're sitting, and not be able to get through, and what will happen at the Thatcher intersection or what will happen at the Reedsdale intersection. I think those are safety concerns. But
Yes,
thank you
I
very
think-
much for your comments.
I think you're absolutely right, because I think, and I maybe didn't explain it very well, but when you're congested, driver behavior is influenced, and drivers will take more risks. They will run lights more frequently because they've been in a longer delay. So you think you're absolutely right on that. Or I agree with you, I should say.
Thank you, Mr. Black. Beverly, anyone else?
Yes, we have Cheryl.
I knew that Cheryl was hoping to speak tonight, so yes, that'd be great.
Okay.
Thank you. I'd request to be elevated to panelist so that I can screen share per my email earlier in the week, Bev.
Yes.
Thank you.
Absolutely. You should be all set.
All right, thank you. Let me just get the screen share. Is my screen share visible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Cheryl Tagayas, 660 Canton Avenue. And while I am a member of the planning board, tonight I'm speaking to you as a resident, as a neighbor, and as an architect. I've been a practicing architect in the Boston area for, I hate to say it, but over 30 years. And I've been looking at this project since it was first applied to Mass Housing for a project eligibility letter. The application has consistently lacked three-dimensional information. And so I have produced three-dimensional information because I think it's helpful to understand the project and the potential impacts of the project on the surrounding community. So I prepared this graphic, which is to scale. The graphics are based upon the applicant's information as well as readily available data from public sources. So the building as proposed, as the town's peer review architect said, is designed as a big parking garage with the building on top, which is disconnected to the site around it. And I think this graphic demonstrates that. The parking garage is a footprint of 1.6 acres, and then it has a big building on top of it. That parking deck or plinth is 350 feet long by 200 feet wide, as others have said. But that plinth is also located 93 feet from Ms. O'Neill's home, the historic 1700s home on Holmes Lane. And it's 106 feet from 656 Canton Avenue, the Kelly's home. And the bulk of the building is shifted to that corner closest to the Kelly's home. So if we look at this more eye level or closer to eye level, we can see the scale of this when we talk about something being disconnected to the site and something that looks palatial. And then you wrap a ring road around it that's close to the boundaries of the property, and you have no room for any adequate buffers. Cliff Bomer, the peer review architect, talked about that, but a visual, I think, helps explain it. Even the plinth closest to Ms. O'Neill's property is a 12-foot height plus the guardrail handright, which is going to be required around the perimeter of that plinth. And there's absolutely no connection from that plinth down to grade. What you see there where the man is standing in the graphic is where the entrance to the parking garage would be. And this is to scale, as I said, 57 feet tall is the tallest portion of this. And that's the portion actually when you drive up the road or you look up the road from Canton Avenue that you would see. All trees are removed, no space around the building, no room to transition and scale or to provide any kind of buffer to the neighbors. The impact to the neighbors is significant. This is a quote at the bottom from the peer review letter. The overall impression that the building gives from the street, Canton Avenue, is monumental and uninviting. You can see here that because of the slope, a 57-foot tall building at the place at which it meets grade is actually 75 feet above the sidewalk level at Canton Avenue. And that is a 380-foot distance. I've heard the architect for the applicant describe it as 800 feet away, but he's talking about the far end of the building and not the front end of the building. It's actually, from their plans, 380 feet from Canton Avenue. And again, it's 350 feet long, but it is 350 feet long, about 30 feet from the southern property line that runs the entire length of the Kelly property and is in the 100-foot buffer zone. This is the Kelly property, and you can see the existing home, yellow, which is on 648 Canton Avenue, that's slated to be demolished. And you can see what the impact would be of this building, again, which is monumental in scale, 106 feet away from the Kelly's home, and taking up the entire length of the property. Again, a quote from the architect peer review letter: given the infill nature and limited size of the available site, this proposal is unprecedented in its lack of recognition of and connection with the surrounding context. I believe this is absolutely the case. Let's talk about monumental scale. This is Buckingham Palace. It is also 350 feet long. Actually, it's 355 feet. It's 3 stories in height, but I'm guessing that its height floor to floor is higher, and that is probably comparable to what's being proposed. The elevation at the bottom of this page is the southern elevation from the applicant's application, showing the 350-foot long facade. Canton Avenue would be to the left, and 652 Canton Avenue would be to the right. You can see the kind of brown color at the bottom is the garage level. So while it's into the ground on the right towards 652, it is completely out of the ground on the left towards Canton Avenue and towards the Kelly property, again, where it is 57 feet tall. This is definitely palatial and monumental in scale as proposed. Now let's think about buffer. And Mr. Boehmer also said that taller buildings work better when they're further away from their neighbors and with adequate buffers. This is the section closest to where the Kelly property is at 656 Canton Avenue. So you have the building at 57 feet tall here. You have a new roadway at 22 feet wide here. You have an existing stone wall here. You have catch basin that's going to be put into the new roadway. All of this, as Mr. Palmer said, with trees along the property line. This one's shown actually on the Kelly side, but there's also trees along here, and there would be disruption to the root ball of this existing tree with the construction of this roadway and the drainage system. And again, this is also very close to the 25-foot no disturb zone and the stream. This project needs to be redesigned for a project that fits the site and the context. The site plan on the lower right is the existing condition survey with a similar look at it as Mr. Palmer discussed when you actually look at the size of the trees. And you can actually see that there is an opening, and that's where the tennis court is currently, which doesn't have nearly the level of trees, and certainly not the legacy trees that he spoke of. And so if you looked at how to plan this site, you could preserve the existing home and convert it to multiple units potentially, or keep it a single family. And you can preserve and maintain significant specimen trees and a tree buffer, because that provides the kind of buffer that's necessary for a new development of larger than a single family to fit into a site like this. And it would allow you to have the adequate setbacks and buffers and scale transitions that are appropriate for fitting a new development into a site and context such as this. And that concludes my comments.
Thank you very much. That was helpful. Beth, do we have anyone else in the queue that wants to be heard this evening?
Yes, we do. Kristen?
Good evening, Kristen Repa from 654 Canton Avenue in butter to the property. I apologize that I don't have our peer reviewer's name at my fingertips. I apologize that, but it's the hydrologist that I was looking to ask your opinion of. My question is basically in digging and preparing the site for construction management. We've all talked about the groundwater, and my concern or my question is, if there was this big construction and digging in, I don't know, I apologize again, I didn't take notes, but some ridiculous number of big trucks of landfill being removed from the property, holding water back in order to do the construction. My question is what would that do to the neighbors upstream? In your professional opinion, would that make the stream, this intermittent stream that we all have through our yards, would that dry up or would that cool up? That is really, that's it.
I'm not sure whether that's for John or myself, but I'll take
Right.
part of it.
Sure.
Regarding the hydrologic impacts, it could have either effect depending on the final design, but the current design suggests that the stormwater is going to be drained away from the site into the street drainage, which is going to reduce the amount of water going into the ground. In that case, it would dry up the stream with less flow. That would be the impact.
Thank you. Thank you. My only additional comment then is, that seems obviously harmful to the wetlands. It sounds like it might eradicate them or make it, not as inhabitable for, creatures and things like that. So just to finish my comment is that, we live here because we love that part of our neighborhood. And we'd hate for that part of our neighborhood to change like that. We enjoy having the wetlands here and what comes with it.
Well,
Thank you very much for your time.
If I may,
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just to respond to that last part, as I mentioned, the Wetlands Protection Regulations, which is a state law, Massachusetts Wetland Protection Regulations do not allow those alterations. So while I indicated that the project would result in drying up, I don't believe that that would be allowed. It would be a violation of state law, and my understanding of Chapter 40B is the ZBA doesn't have any authority to waive any state laws. They can only consider a waiver of local laws. So there's absolutely no possibility that they could violate that state law.
Thank you. Bev, anyone else?
Yes. David?
This is David Taher, 756 Canton Avenue. I live at the top of Canton Avenue. And just for the planning board, just for your own edification, all of my neighbors and I have sump pumps in our basements, and we use them every spring. I have lived in my house for 21 years. I have used a sump pump every spring. And I'm at the top of Canton Avenue, so I figure my water table is probably about 15 to 18 inches. And I get a wet backyard when I have a downpour. So I don't know how 648 is going to manage the water, but I know you're experienced planning department people, and I know you've got some expertise to help you out here. That parking garage, water wins, as you know, and I don't know how it would remain dry, but I guess the developer would figure that out. But maybe they can talk to the engineers of the Big Dig who had to put in millions of dollars of water pumps to remove the water. And I just want to say one more thing to the board. I'm delighted that Cheryl actually shared some pictures of what this thing would look like. It's unfortunate that the developer did not do that. But to think that the town of Milton would have a Buckingham Palace on 648 Canton Avenue is just astounding. It is just unfathomable. I just don't know where you go from here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see. That's it for now.
Okay. Well, I guess that Ned, you've completed your presentation, I trust.
I have, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. It was very helpful to us. I guess at this point, I'd like, as I did last week, I'd like to turn to Mr. Schomer and get his thoughts on where we go from here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Attorney Corcoran and his consultants, Mr. Black, Mr. Cheshire, Mr. Horsley, Mr. Palmer, and perhaps most especially to Ms. Tagayas, who, in addition to being an architect and an expert in her field, is one of the neighbors. We really appreciate the feedback that we've received tonight. This has been edifying for us, as I hope it was for the board. The one caution that I would make to the board and members of the public is that what you've heard tonight is not subject to independent third-party peer review. It will not be subject to independent third-party review. And that contrasts with everything that the developer is saying to you, to the board and the public, and is showing to you in our plans. All that will be subject to independent third-party review by the peer reviewers who are in this process to help the board to review this and to determine these questions that are being raised tonight by these consultants. So we respect the opinions of all these gentlemen and Ms. Tagayas, but from the development team, we're focused primarily on addressing these issues directly with the peer reviewers that are in place for the town's benefit. With that having been said, I don't mean to diminish anything that's been said tonight, and we do very much appreciate the feedback from these consultants as well as from the other members of the public who spoke tonight. In terms of the path forward from here, Mr. Chair, what I would like to propose and suggest and bring this to the board for your views on this is my understanding is that we currently have an additional hearing date scheduled for 2 weeks from tonight. And what I would propose is that we keep that date on the books, and the applicant would intend to come back on that evening with additional information from the board in terms of how we intend to proceed. And what I mean by that specifically is we intend to take the next 2 weeks from tonight and sit with our development team and come up with the best way we feel to appropriately respond to the concerns from the peer reviewers, from the town departments, from the fire chief, the police, as well as Attorney Corcoran's consultants, and come back to the board with a revision to this project that we feel is appropriate to respond to these concerns.
Well, I can't speak for the other board members, but that is fine with me. So that would be on April 27th. So we would come back.
Yes, Mr. Chair, that would be our intent.
And so we would not have a hearing on April 20th. We would skip that week and come back on the 27th.
Unless I'm mistaken, Mr. Chair, I don't currently have the 20th in my calendar for a hearing date, but that may have been an omission on my part.
I'm not sure either, but it doesn't really matter. So our next hearing would be April 27th. Now, would you plan to make available to the board in advance of that hearing whatever it is that you propose by way of change or amendment to the existing scheme or plan?
Yes, Mr. Chair, and we would, that would be our intent. And just to give you some background, Mr. Chair, and Ms. Barrett and Mr. Zerwinski are perhaps a little bit more familiar with this, with how this worked on the Blue Hill Avenue project that recently got to this stage a couple of weeks before this proposal. What we did on that project, and I thought it was as a very useful exercise, is we spent a time period similar to this that we're proposing and go back to the drawing board and come back with somewhat of a preliminary idea in terms of what the revision for this project will be. It wouldn't be fully designed at that point. There would be further revisions. The engineering would need to catch up, but it would provide the broad strokes of how we intend to move forward and respond to these concerns that we've heard so far.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar with what's gone on with Blue Avenue. I purposely stayed away from that. Okay, I mean, that's fine with me, and we'd be happy to see sort of the direction that you want to proceed in on April 27th. And I said it would be very helpful for us to have some of those documents in advance so that we can sort of speak intelligently with you about what you propose. Then I guess at the conclusion of the April 27th hearing, I guess we would discuss where we are and where we go from there.
I think that makes sense, Mr. Chair. And just to reiterate what Mr. Tamposi said at the beginning of the hearing, I want to echo his sentiments and let everyone know, Attorney Corcoran, members of the public, and you, the board members, that we are listening, and we have been since the outset of this hearing. And we are committed to responding to these issues and coming up with a project that not only works for us as the developer, not only creates needed affordable housing in Milton, but also addresses the neighborhood's concerns. And we're committed to that.
Okay, let me ask Mr. Daver and Mr. Brown, is this program work for you guys?
Yeah, it works for me. It sounds good.
Mr. Daver? Ted, you're on mute.
Ted, you're on mute.
Mute.
Oh.
There we go.
Sorry, I thought I had. Can you hear me now?
We can't hear you now. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought I had unmuted myself. I guess the one question I had, and I'm in agreement with it, but how broad strokes are we talking about? I mean, how broad will the broad strokes be?
Well, I think, Mr. Daber, our intent would be to come back with a concept plan that would show, more or less a proposed massing plan, number of units and locations of where those would be, such that could be designed further as the project catches up. And our hope would be, and in furtherance of this, we would try to get these into the board's hands with as much advance notice of that hearing as possible. Our hope would be to get some very preliminary feedback from the board in terms of how you feel about the plan. Do you think it's an improvement or not an improvement? And we could go from there in designing the plan in a more fully realized version.
Okay, thank you.
That's fine. Well, that's the way we will proceed then. We'll adjourn the hearing this evening. We'll come back at 7 o'clock on April 27th. Show me you'll do what you can to get the materials to us in advance so that we can talk intelligently with you about what is being proposed, and we'll go from there.
May I interrupt?
Of course.
I'm sorry. Lara Roche has her hand up.
Okay, this is the last one I'm going to take though, Beverly. I mean,
Yes.
we're at the conclusion of this now, but since if somebody's already on with the hand up, go ahead.
Hi, this is Lara Roach, 44 Holmes Lane. May I ask that perhaps in 2 weeks when we regroup, that the density or the massing studies, those be included as part of that? Because as abutters, I think, and even not direct abutters, but we find those incredibly helpful and very valuable. So if that could be something that was included in that regroup, I think it would be greatly appreciated. 3D images, things like that.
I'll leave that to Mr. Schomer.
Just to be perfectly frank on that one, Ms. Rocha, and through the chair, within the next 2 weeks is probably not enough time for us to come up with 3D massing studies, but it would be our intent to provide those as the project moves forward, as the plans are more fully realized. And you have my commitment on that.
Okay, yeah, I think the massing studies that we have received so far have been done by the planning board in Milton, and so it seems that no massing studies actually have been done by the applicant's team. So I think if that's something that can be prioritized, again, that would be greatly appreciated.
Understood.
Understood.
Okay. Well, thank you all. As always, it's been an enlightening evening, and We'll look forward to.
Mr. Chair, can I chime in very, very quickly?
Sure.
And this is something that we can probably deal with in 2 weeks. I just want to remind everyone that the week after April 27th is the week of town meeting. And so depending on how that hearing goes, I suspect that the applicant will be sent off to do some additional homework, as Mr. Schomer has kind of articulated. There's some more design work that would need to be done. But we want to make sure that we're not conflicting with town meeting if there's a continuation.
Sure, we can deal with that when we come back on the 27th. But your point is well taken. Obviously, we don't want to have a public hearing while the town meeting is going on. Thank you for that. Okay, thank you everyone for your participation. It was very enlightening tonight, and I look forward to hearing from you all on April 27th. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.